Hello dear students, welcome to Bajirao Ias Academy interview guidance program. So in this session we are going to discuss India and its climate action, right? So climate change and India's climate action is very important for interview. You can expect questions on this topic, right? So climate change and climate action are very important for India. India has taken up several steps in this regard in order to achieve its climate commitments under Paris Climate Deal as well as the Panchamrit commitments. Now, firstly, we need to understand, so what exactly is the climate change? Climate change is the long-term change in the climate or the atmosphere of a region, right? So this is known as climate change. Now climate change is being associated with several negative consequences. So however, the major reason for climate change is the anthropogenic factors rather than the natural factors. So the anthropogenic factors involve emission of fossil fuel and industrial emissions, and also the resources extraction and wasteful usage of resources, degradation of natural environment, pollution. All these factors have been leading to the climate change, right? So climate change has a wide variety of implications, right? For example, recent COVID-19 pandemic, melting of glaciers, sea level rise, forest fires, deforestation, and the disasters like cyclones, earthquakes, tsunamis. So everything can be associated with the climate change. Now because of the climate change, we also see the degradation of natural environments as well as the biodiversity loss. So therefore, in this context, we have briefly understood about the climate change and its consequences. Now we will try to understand India's emission standards, right? So India's historic emission records. Now if you look at the current emissions of India actually contributes historically. If you look at India historically, so its overall historical cumulative CO2 emissions is just 3%. Okay, so this is much lower than many developed countries in the West. Now after that, if you look at 2021 share of global emissions, so India stood at 7.5% of the total share of the global emissions. So India is a third highest emitter globally after US and China. So even though India is the third largest emitter, if you look at the per capita emissions of greenhouse gases, it is much lower than several other countries. So now India is a country with a largest population, so therefore in this context the per capita emission of greenhouse gases is much lower. So after that, the per capita emissions, the per capita carbon emissions are still very low at 1.3 tons per person per year. Now if you compare this number with the United States, the per capita emission of United States is 4 ton. However, the per capita emission of India is just 1.3 ton. So therefore, even though India is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, it's still lagging behind when it comes to the per capita emissions, right? So India can rightfully use the fossil fuels or emit greenhouse gases, so right, so because its per capita emissions are lower. However, India had been taking up a number of measures to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. Even several developed countries have not been taking such measures. Now in this context, we need to talk about the intended nationally determined contributions or targets under the Paris Agreement that were announced by India. Now firstly, we need to talk about the 45% reduction. Okay, so the first INDC target under the Paris Agreement of India is 45% reduction in emission intensity by 2030 from the 2005 levels. Okay, so this is the first commitment of India in the Paris Agreement. Okay, so 45% reduction of emission intensity by 2030 from 2005 levels. Secondly, 50% of all electricity to be generated by the non-fossil fuel energy by the year 2030. Right? So total energy or total electricity, out of total electricity, 50% of the electricity to be generated from the non-fossil fuel energy. Now additionally, the carbon sink of 2.3 billion tons, 2.5 to 3 billion ton of CO2 equivalent by 2030 through free and tree and forest cover. Now generally what happens when you create additional forest cover, it will help in sequestration of the carbon, right? So you may have heard about REDD plus and REDD. Okay, so reduction of emissions through deforestation, those programs were sponsored and assisted by the World Bank. So therefore additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion ton of CO2 equivalent by 2030 through creation of additional tree and forest cover. Right, so these are the intended nationally determined contributions of India announced during the Paris Agreement. Now after that we need to talk about the achievements or progress made by India in this regard. Right, so we have announced the targets. So what are our achievements, what is our progress in this regard? Now India had already achieved emission reduction of 21% over the 2005 levels. Right, so India already achieved the emission reduction. Now India's overall target of emission reduction is 45%, but India already achieved 25% of emission reduction. Now India already achieved 43% of the installed electricity capacity from the non-fossil fuel sources. Right, so already 43% of the total installed electricity is coming from the non-fossil fuel sources. Now non-fossil fuel sources involves wind energy, solar energy, and biofuel energy, so everything. Right, so this is also in progress. Now after that the non-fossil fuel energy capacity stood at 179.3 gigawatt in April 2023. Right, so India also had the target of creating additional forest 2.5 to 3 billion ton of CO2 sequestration, equivalent to the 2.5 to 3 billion ton of CO2. So therefore India created total forest and tree cover, and it makes up to 24.62%. Okay, so overall it makes up to 24.62% of the total geographical area of India. Now if you look at the national forest policy, it has recommended that around 33% of the geographical area should be in forest or under tree cover. So however, the forest and tree cover makes up to 24.62% of the total geographical area. Now the current run rate of 1.9 to 2.0 gigatons of CO2s will be created as an additional carbon sink. Okay, so therefore after looking at all this data, we can arrive at a conclusion that India has been rapidly progressing in achieving the intended nationally determined contributions. So however, apart from that, this India has also revised the intended nationally determined contributions and also announced the Panchamrut commitments. Right, so Panchamrut commitments can be categorized as a revision of the existing intended nationally determined contributions. So in this respect, we need to understand what are these Panchamrut commitments. During COP26 summit that was held in Glasgow, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had promised 5 commitments to the world from the Indian side. So what are those 5 commitments which outlines India's overall climate action, India's overall attempt to curb the climate? Okay, so firstly, achieving the net zero by the year 2070. So this is very significant, even though countries like China, which are much more developed compared to India, so they have announced net zero target by 2060. And most of the developing countries have announced the net zero target by 2050. So in this respect, India is still lagging behind in several social indicators like education, healthcare, living standards, so everything. So despite this, India had announced that it will become net zero by 2070. So in this respect, can India become net zero by 2070? Now what is net zero in this context? Net zero is whatever emissions you have released, you have the capacity to absorb those emissions. Right, so this is net zero emissions. So in this respect, does India really have the capability to become net zero? Now if you look at India's progress and India's transition towards the a green economy, or achieving its climate commitments, it gives a sense that it is possible. Okay, so therefore India has been making a rapid progress towards a greener transition. Now after that, the second target is increase in non-fossil fuel energy capacity by 500 gigawatt by the year 2030. Right now, the non-fossil fuel energy, so that is created from waste to energy, biofuel energy, right, ethanol, so everything can be considered as non-fossil energy. Now we already achieved the 10% blending of ethanol in petrol and diesel, and we also have the target of 20% blending of ethanol in petrol and diesel. So therefore we have been focusing on achieving non-fossil energy capacity 500 gigawatt by the year 2030. So after that, 50% of its energy requirements, so whatever energy requirements we have by the year 2030, so 50% of those energy requirements will be met through the renewable energy resources like wind, solar and other renewable energy resources. Now in this context, the tariffs of these renewable energy resources is very high compared to the conventional electricity generation or electricity which is produced from the purchase from the discoms. So therefore in this context, when we have more and more technology research and when private sector is ready to participate in renewable electricity generation, then there will be a competition or competitiveness in the economy, and that helps in reducing the tariffs of these renewable sources. Okay, so or renewable electricity resources. So that is the essence of success of the renewable energy resources. Now after that, we need to talk about the total projected carbon emissions will be reduced by 1 billion ton from now on till 2030. Okay, so total projected carbon emissions will also be reduced by 1 billion tons from now on to till 2030. Okay, so after that, reduce carbon intensity of its economy by less than 45% by the 2030. Okay, so the carbon intensity of the economy has to be reduced. Okay, so when we are able to reduce our carbon intensity and when we are able to make a faster transition towards a greener economy or cleaner economy, so that is the essence of meeting or achieving our existing commitments. So therefore in this context, we also have the fifth commitment, that is reduce the carbon intensity of its economy by less than 45% by 2030. So these are the 5 commitments that were made by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and we are making a rapid progress, rapid transition towards meeting all these objectives. Now after that, what are the challenges in achieving climate goals? So it is very important that we need to understand the challenges in achieving all these climate goals. Okay, so if you look at the world, there's lack of consensus, there's lack of coordination on achieving the goals, or there's a concerted climate action. There's lack of concerted climate action at the global level. Now if you look at the Paris climate deal itself, US was not part of the Paris climate deal, right? So because of this reason, since there were divergences between these countries, there's lack of consensus, and consensus building is also not easy at the global level. So nations don't agree even on the most important baselines. For example, net zero emissions. Now several countries have announced net zero emissions by 2050, but even though they have announced 2050, they are still reluctant to become a net zero by 2050. Okay, so because of the developmental compulsions, even though they are already developed, still they are reluctant to announce their net zero targets by 2050, and achieving consensus building on this is also not very easy. Or when how much green finance to be done, right? So for example, there was a green climate fund, and according to the Paris deal, all the developed countries, they have to shoulder the historic responsibility, and they have to contribute at least $100 billion for the technology and finance for the developing countries. So therefore there's still lack of consensus, lack of coordination on the net zero emissions and green financing, as well as the technology transfer as well. So because of this reason, the climate action has not actually gaining a lot of prominence in recent past. Now if we mention an example, UK has proposed of phasing out coal in short time. Okay, now UK has proposed phasing out coal based thermal power plants in a very short period of time. So what about countries which primarily dependent on fossil fuels like coal for the electricity generation? Can they be can they make a faster transition towards non-fossil fuel energy generation, so without finance and technology transfer? And this is what we need to think, and this can be a challenge at the global level for the climate action. Now after that, we need to talk about the clean technology. Even though several western developed countries have the necessary technology, but they are reluctant to transfer those technology to the developed countries or low income group countries. So since these low income country group of countries cannot invest in clean technology, and they cannot invest significant or substantial amount of money on research, so this also impacting the climate action at the global level. And this is further worsened by the apathy of the higher income groups towards the transfer of technology. So this essentially means that they were reluctant to transfer technology to the low income group of countries. Now we have discussed the challenges in achieving climate goals at the global level, but we need to understand the challenges at the level of our nation as well. Now firstly, there is always a debate of environment and economy, or ecology or economy, right? So what should be prioritized, whether we should prioritize ecology or we should prioritize the economic growth. So India is a country which do not have adequate living standards for its population, and still substantial amount of people living in poverty, right? So therefore in this context, in order to uplift people from their poor living conditions, we require economic growth and economic development. However, in this process, we should not destroy the natural resources, we should not degrade the natural environment, and that is where the actual debate has started. So when we mention example, India has a large number of people who are dependent on coal economy, okay, for jobs, right? So in fact, India dependent on 70% of its total electricity, or not just 70 but around 60% of its total electricity is being generated from the thermal power plants. So in this context, how can India phase out coal or thermal power plants? And this is very important in this context. So however, simultaneously India has been rapidly developing the renewable energy generation projects. So after that, the political economy also should be kept in mind, right? So if you look at the industries like thermal power plants, cement, iron, steel industries, so these are some of the core industries in different states, right? So and these industries are also the largest emitters of the greenhouse gases. Now when India adopt any policies which may have negative implications on these core industries, so therefore we can expect some stiff regional political setbacks or pushbacks also, even if we implement stronger climate action, right? So because they have been providing employment, and they are core industries, and they are very crucial for the economic growth and economic development of different states. So therefore, since they are the largest emitters, so even if we implement these climate goals in a stiff and strong manner, that could have a lot of implications, you can expect the regional political pushbacks as well. So after that, we need to talk about the standard of living of the people. Okay, so when people have higher incomes, there is a possibility that could pollute the environment, right? So that could pollute the environment, and because people buying air conditions cars, that could release in vehicular emissions, and that could also contribute to the greenhouse gases. So all these things will have more and more severe consequences for the global climate. So therefore, in this context, what measures have to be taken in order to achieve the desired targets under the climate action? Now firstly, we need to talk about the capital reallocation aspect, right? So capital allocation or finance mobilization is very important whenever we talk about the climate action. So therefore, in this context, first and foremost, we need to talk about the climate finance aspect. Around 3.5 trillion increase in spending on low emissions assets versus today. Okay, so we need to scale up the climate finance. So when we increase the climate finance, so that could significantly help us meet the targets. And after that, we need to talk about the financial instruments. New financial instruments must be developed at different levels, right? So these financial instruments will help us finance the short term and long term projects which have positive implications on the global climate. Now after that, we need to talk about the pricing externalities to rebalance the incentives. And there should be policies to encourage capital spending on emission reduction projects. For example, if any country has taken up emission reduction projects, so those emission reduction projects have to be financed, and policies must encourage those emission reduction projects. And funding the repurposing of the decommissioning of redundant assets. For example, when we talk about the thermal coal power plants, so countries should gradually look to phase out these thermal power plants over a period of time, so that will benefit the global climate, right? We need to shift towards we need to make a transition towards the renewable resources, so they are climate friendly. And in fact, we need to focus on the green hydrogen, so that is also environment friendly. And few countries have been exploring the opportunities to produce electricity through nuclear fission and nuclear fusion technologies. So they are producing more energy, so that could significantly reduce our dependence on coal power plants. So after that, we need to look at the demand and shift management aspect as well, right? So in this context, we need to build transparency around climate risks and opportunities. We need to identify the climate risks and climate opportunities, and we should focus on building transparency around this. So after that, we need to talk about the climate stress. Okay, so climate stress should be taken into consideration while making investments, and we need to identify measures to manage the cost increase and distribute the impact of cost increase across the value chain. Okay, so there will be no concentration of the costs or benefits at a particular point of time. So it will help in further diffusion of the responsibility across different segments or across the value chain. So incentives for making low emission technology cost competitive. So whenever we have a low emission technology, so that has to be made more and more competitive or cost effective. So in this context, we need to lift demand for low emission tech to achieve the economies of scale, right? So in this context, we need to further lift the demand for low emission technology to achieve economies of scale. Now after that, we need to talk about the compensation mechanism also in this regard. Now when we talk about the compensation mechanism, supporting the economic development and diversification, right? So see, economic development must be backed by the environmental sustainability. Now that is where we can call this development as sustainable growth or sustainable development. So therefore, in this context, the economic development must be supported by the diversification and reskilling and redeployment of the workers. So in this context, green skills are very important, right? So reskilling and redeployment of people will help in more efficient usage of the existing resources. So after that, we need to focus on retaining the existing workforce, or existing workers, and right skills needed in a low carbon economy. So after that, instituting support for the displaced workers because of the climate change or climate change related impacts. Now you have to remember at least two of these measures or two of these suggestions in each of these factors. For example, capital reallocation, demand shift management, and compensation mechanism, right? So when we remember at least 2 points in each of these topic, so you can clearly say your opinion, or you will not have any confusion over your answer, right? So that will definitely impress the board members, right? So that's all for this session, and next session we will talk about the central bank digital currency and demographic dividend in India. Thank you.